My name is Julie Wise. I'm an associate professor in the history department.
And I'm Malik Najjar. I'm a professor of theater arts here in the theater arts department.
And please silence your cell phones if you have not done so already.
We'd appreciate that. We just want to say this event has been sponsored by the Division of Global Engagement and many of our co-sponsors on campus. So thank you to all of our co-sponsors for taking the time to be with us either in person or otherwise for this event. So we are a group of faculty who began to meet in the fall after the events of October 7th and the resulting war in Gaza. Last winter term, we held a theatrically based event where students, faculty, and community members acted scenes from plays by Jewish and Arab artists regarding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, followed by a curated question and answer session. Before that time, we had created some shared principles, and we're going to take some time to read a somewhat truncated version of our shared principles, just so that we all start with the same understanding of where we're at as a group and also as an audience, and then we'll introduce our esteemed speakers. You can get the full version on the Division of International Engagement website, but we'll just read some that we've selected to share tonight. This group consists of colleagues with a wide variety of positions. We are not necessarily in full agreement on every aspect of the Israel-Palestine conflict, but we all agree that we do not want to dehumanize either side and that we regret the loss of life on any side. We will open events with this point. We believe that in times of global crisis, we as educators have a responsibility to provide learning opportunities, to share research-based information, to present the multiplicity and complexity of conflicting narratives and discourses, and to provide a safe space for respectful discussion and civil conversation to promote learning and model understanding and empathy.
Many students are confused, anxious, worried, and in pain. For some of them, public educational events and fora represent an essential institutional response to the situation and a form of care.
We are best served by teaching complexity, by helping students understand the multiplicity of contexts and perspectives, and by modeling how to hold complexity with curiosity and empathy.
Advocacy of the eradication of other sides, positions of violent, harmful intolerance that exceed the limits of tolerant discourse will be considered out of bounds for this group's fora and events. We will take necessary steps to set and enforce this boundary.
Open microphone events are probably not productive at this time. Audience input will be curated. Questions can be written on cards, which you should have on your chairs, and submitted to us, the organizers, who will then select them for representativeness, educational value, and avoidance of one-sidedness or intolerance. So those just give us some basic ground rules for how this is going to go this evening, and now we'll introduce our speakers. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Hussein Ibish, a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. He is a regular columnist for The National, The Atlantic, and The Daily Beast. He has written numerous books and essays, including his recent book, What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda? Why Ending the Occupation and Peace with Israel is Still the Palestinian National Goal. Dr. Ibish was included in all 3 years, 2011, 12, and 13, of Foreign Policy's Twitterati 100, the magazine's list of 100 must-follow Twitter feeds on foreign policy. Dr. Ibish previously served as a senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine and the executive director of the Foundation for Arab American Leadership. He holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst.
And I'm thrilled to be introducing Dr. David Schraub, an associate professor of law at Lewis and Clark, just up the road, who teaches constitutional law and anti-discrimination law. He is a prolific writer on contemporary issues of racism, anti-Semitism, and free speech. And here I will particularly note his influential 2019 article, White Jews: An Intersectional Approach, as well as his widely read blog, The Debate Link. Dr. Schraub is a lead drafter of the Nexus document on anti-Semitism, which parses anti-Semitism and discourse on Israel with nuance and care, and was referenced in President Biden's 2023 National Strategy to Combat Anti-Semitism. His current academic work explores A relevant topic, dilemmas faced by university administrators regulating campus protests and other free speech controversies. He has a BA from Carleton College, a law degree from University of Chicago, and a PhD in political science from UC Berkeley.
Please give our speakers a hand. Thank you both. So, we have posed 3 questions to our presenters. They will take them one at a time within specific time limits. In the case of the first question, there will also be a chance for each to respond to the other. Questions will be taken on index cards and selected through the criteria described before. So as we go along, please feel free to write your questions on those cards.
And Harinder will be here giving little time signals to help people stay on track. So I'll ask the first question, and we did send these to them in advance. Can you please define the terminology for anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and provide a brief historical context to help understand these concepts more comprehensively, all in 8 minutes? So we'll let
each of us to address both, or he does anti-Semitism and I do Islamophobia?
I think probably it's to have a more complete answer. Let's let you address Islamophobia and David can address anti-Semitism.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So we'll ask, I guess Hussein can go first, and then we will go from there. Thank you.
Stopwatch here. All right, so Islamophobia. First of all, let me say thank you all very much for letting me be here with you. And I'm really delighted to be at this event. It's the kind of thing that if more universities did, there would be less unrest on college campuses, especially if they've done it proactively in the beginning, fulfilling the mandate of the university to be a center of education rather than a free-for-all of chaos. And, but when you do nothing, you leave a vacuum. I also would just like to add that I wrote and edited 3 books on discrimination against Arab Americans and Muslim Americans on 1998 to 2000, 2000 to 2001, and then the year after 9/11, which are the only documents of their kind. They're long reference books. Okay, Islamophobia.
Can you speak loud?
Yes, I can speak, of course. If you can't hear me. There we go. So I can, yeah, of course I can, yeah. All right. So, sorry, right. I'm also losing my hearing. Too many rock concerts when I was a kid. No, I'm not kidding. So, Islamophobia, I think, like anti-Semitism, if I may, is a very unfortunate term, right? I wish we had a different word. It's wrong in all its aspects, but it's the one we're stuck with. And once it takes root, there is less point in arguing over the letters, you know, that form the word than arguing over the content of how we interpret what it means. So Islamophobia is a relatively recent word. It really arose in Europe in the 1990s in certain committee work. Certain academics posited it as a way of describing hatred and fear of Muslim communities in the West that were new and growing and alien, and in the European context sort of supplanted Jewish communities as the alien other in this supposedly traditional white European Christian culture in countries like France and Denmark and Germany and Holland and Italy and what have you, right? Across the board, Spain. Yeah. The word literally means fear of Islam. Well, that's wrong, because that's not what it's supposed to describe, I think. It has come to mean hatred and discrimination against Muslims as an identity class. That's what it means. That insofar as people are define themselves as Muslims, or in my case, as part of the Muslim community, and I'll explain what I mean in a minute because it is important, that they can be targeted for discrimination, for defamation, for generalized derogation, that they can be held collectively responsible for actions the way other people are not, that they can be the target of conspiracy theories that are often organized or semi-organized, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, that are kind of organically organized. They're you know, it's not like there's a Wannsee conference, but there is some coordination, and I'll demonstrate what I mean by that. Islamophobia has very deep roots. I mean, fear of Muslims in Western culture goes back to the birth of Islam, obviously, because Islam emerges in the 7th and 8th century in Arabia and then quickly spreading east, west, and north, not too far south, a bit south, but east, west, and north, you know, to the gates of France. Fairly quickly, to India fairly quickly, to the Balkans fairly quickly, and it spread rapidly, and it was a real shock to a Europe that defined itself at the time not as Europe but as Christendom, right? You know, it was a land of Christians. It was also a big shock to see the fall of Constantinople, the fall of the Byzantine Empire very quickly at the hands of the new Islamic rulers, and the fall of Spain, which was also a very big shock, which is why the Reconquista, which immediately precedes the expulsion of the Jews and the Muslims of Spain, and then subsequently the colonization of the New World with all its brutality, all of that is kind of interconnected in some very fundamental ways, but there is this notion of the importance of the Reconquista in restoring a European sense of amour propre, of self-regard, of righting the balance, of creating at least a balance, and not feeling absolutely invaded. This obviously spreads over time, and with the arrival, and this is what's crucial, I mean, there's all this, rivalry and hatred and religious animosity and whatnot. It's not important. What's important is the emergence of Muslim communities in Western societies in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and more and more and more. In the United States, for example, the Arab American community originally was overwhelmingly Christian. And until really the 1990s, it was still very heavily Christian because the initial waves were so heavily Christian. Well, there were some very prominent Muslims, but still the big majority were Levantine, Syrian, Palestinian, and above all Lebanese Christians. But over time, more and more Muslims come, and they become perceived as a threat and used, I think, strategically by people who use fear and hatred for strategic purposes, to promote themselves politically or to promote a sense of ethnic or religious paranoia in order to benefit from that. And there was this sort of cottage industry of anti-Muslim catastrophizing that emerged strongly after the end of the Cold War, because people on the far right of the United States, conspiracy theorists who used to talk about the Battle of Armageddon in terms of the conflict with the Soviet Union, started looking towards Muslims. When 9/11 happened, there were a whole series of disparate discourses that were not unified, so that there was no initial major backlash against Muslims. There was some violent backlash, but rhetorically, culturally, it took about a year or a year and a half before the polling started changing and Muslims started, and Islam started becoming wildly unpopular in the United States, because the different discourses that were promoting fear and hatred of Muslims or Arab Americans, because there's a conflation between them that is irrational and false, but it's very widespread. I mean, it goes across the board, really. And I've run out of time, but I mean, just to finish my thought, what you ended up with then is a desperate period of about 6 or 7 years of incredible pressure on the American Muslim community, and similar situations, parallel situations in Europe. There are important differences, but political events drive this discourse. And the fact that there has not been additional major terrorist attacks coming out of Salafist jihadist groups or anything like that has, I think, helped right the crisis. But the Islamophobic discourse remains. It's inherited, and nothing has been done to fix it. It is not dormant. It is merely a subtext to many other conversations. One of the first things Trump did was the Muslim ban. Why? Because it was very popular to ban Muslims from coming into the U.S. Yeah?
I also want to express my gratitude to all of you for coming, for being invited here. But in particular, I'm just so honored to be sharing this stage with you, Hussein. You're somebody who I've learned. I'm sure one of the very early followers of you on the Twitterati way back when. I've learned from you for many, many years. This is actually the first opportunity that we've had to meet in person, even after many, many years of learning from one another. And I'm just so delighted to have that opportunity.
It's entirely shared.
So anti-Semitism, as you said, also somewhat of a misnomer. What it means is discrimination or bigotry or oppression of Jews. But it derives from, initially, efforts in 19th century Germany to try to create a scientific veneer and parallel to pre-existing kind of religious hatred or discrimination towards Jews. And so they use Semitic to give it this sort of science-y vibe to it, even though Semitic is a language group, not an ethnic group, and it's a language group that doesn't include just Hebrew, so it doesn't really fit. Notwithstanding, right, the way anti-Semitism has been used throughout time has been to refer to Jews specifically, and anti-Jewish discrimination and hatred, the imprecision. Just one more thing we can be annoyed about towards 19th century German bigots.
Big time. I know, big time.
But when we say anti-Semitism is discrimination against or bigotry towards or oppression of Jews, well, what does that entail? What counts as that? Well, my view of it, and it was mentioned that I co-authored a document that tries to take a stab at this, and what we say in this Nexus document is that anti-Semitism consists of anti-Jewish beliefs, attitudes, actions, or systemic conditions, and it includes negative beliefs and feelings about Jews, hostile behavior directed against Jews because they are Jews, and conditions that discriminate against Jews and significantly impede their ability to participate as equals in political, religious, cultural, economic, or social life. How that plays out in practice varies from context to context, but one very common theme one sees in anti-Semitism is that very frequently presents Jews as sort of the ultimate power, right? The ones pulling the strings, the ones in the shadows, the puppet masters. All roads lead back to the Jews, or a Jewish institution, right? And that can be, it kind of doesn't matter what your political hobby horse is, right? Jews will be blamed for capitalism if you're, a socialist. They'll be blamed for socialism and communism if you're a capitalist, right? Either way, right? Jews are the problem that stands in the way and is preventing people from living the good life, right? And in that way, anti-Semitism, I like to say, is a productive ideology. Right? It allows things to happen that couldn't otherwise happen. It makes the implausible plausible. It makes seemingly intractable problems seem tractable, right? You think about, trying to tear down the capitalist order, or you think about trying to, uproot the communist infiltrators. That's a big ask, right? That is hard to do. It is much, much easier, right? And it feels approachable to the extent it can be compartmentalized, right? Inside a relatively small and approachable minority ethnic and political and religious group, right? And so you see, right, that for a variety of political issues du jour, right, people take these huge, sprawling things that either are problems or are presented as problems, right? So, on the far right, immigration, great replacement theory gets laid at the hands of Jews or George Soros or the Rothschild or Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, what have you. But for others, it might be police brutality, right? Gets laid at the feet, and you say this is it's something that happens because of Israel, because of Zionism, because of the ADL, because of Jewish Jewish institutions, takes these sprawling issues, right, and makes them into something more approachable, something that you can wrap your hands around, right? And so Jews fill this role that I think is somewhat distinctive in sort of the ecosystem of bigotry and hatred, which is that it doesn't always present itself as punching down or inferiorization, right? A lot of times it presents itself as punching up. This is the power that we can rally against. This is these are the people above that are holding us down. But reframes that in a way so that victory seems possible, right? You can get at them. And so this notion of Jews as possessing this sort of hyperpower but also vulnerability, I think is deeply central to anti-Semitic ideology. Now, having said all of that, right, I have my pitch for how you should understand anti-Semitism, right? But over the years, I've become more convinced that it's less important that we arrive at a consensus definition and more that we have consistency across different forms of isms, racism, sexism. Islamophobia isn't, again, it causes us problems with the terminology, right? You said every letter is wrong, and it's ruining my metaphor. But so in, the classes that you've taken in campus conversations, you've probably encountered, for example, a variety of different conceptions of what racism is, right? Some think that racism is conscious, intentional hatred of particular racial groups, and no more and no less, right? But others define it more expansively, right? To include things like implicit bias, right? Practices which, regardless of intent, right, have the impact of creating or preserving inequitable barriers in front of particular racial groups. And of course, which definition you use makes a big difference in what is or isn't considered to be racist. Anti-Semitism has those same debates, right? Is anti-Semitism just conscious hatred of Jews, right? Or does it include things that, are like implicit bias or creating these inequitable barriers? The nexus definition, I tend to take the broader approach, and so I wrote it that way to encompass this broader outlook. But there are absolutely important debates that we can have and arguments for different types of definitions, different conceptions, right? And I think we should have those. I think the campus is a really important place to think through the advantages and disadvantages of defining these terms more broadly or more narrowly, right? But I do think we see a lot of frustration, right, when people aren't consistent. Right? If you're somebody who takes a relatively narrow view of racism, right? You say, oh, it's only the KKK and nobody else, right? It's not really fair to suddenly start talking about like subtle microaggressions and things like that and structural harms when it becomes time to talk about anti-Semitism. People are going to notice that pivot, right? Opposite is true too, right? If your view of racism is that it's not just Jim Crow, right? It includes things like malign impacts, even if they lack, true, conscious, sinister intent, right? Then it becomes a bit suspect if one approaches anti-Semitism only by asking, do I hate Jews? No. Okay, we're done here, right? And so the bottom line, right, is that there's a lot we can learn and we should be learning about the excellent classes, conversations we have about other forms of discrimination. These conversations should be interdisciplinary, right? We should be learning from one another. And that's another reason why I'm so happy that we are on this panel together and doing this event together. And when we do that, we might still have legitimate disagreements. And that's fine. That is very normal, right? And when we feel these sort of tensions and troubles in one of these domains, it probably has something to teach us about other ones too. If you're someone who's generally taken the narrow view of isms, but find that maybe this doesn't quite capture certain feelings of unease or marginalization one has with respect to anti-Semitism, right? That's a sign maybe that you should revisit whether or not you might broaden your understanding of these other isms. And again, vice versa. If you think that a broad definition of anti-Semitism is unfairly tarring too much legitimate political dispute as anti-Semitic, right? It's chilling discourse, right? Consider whether or not there are lessons to be learned there and how we deal with other isms as well.
Great, thank you both. Now we'll ask you to each take 5 minutes each to respond to what you've just heard from your fellow speaker.
It's great because what I want to talk about for a second is are the overlapping qualities and symmetries that exist between Islamophobia in its true function, meaning hatred of Muslims and people from Muslim communities, by which I mean I'm an agnostic, right? But I'm totally part of the Muslim community. I'm not exempt from the bigotry at all. And I was very prominent before, during, and after 9/11, and no one cared what my religious beliefs were or weren't on any angle of it, neither in the Muslim community nor in the Islamophobic community or the regular American community. That was neither. No one cared. And I'm not willing to cede my share of the heritage to people who have different spiritual beliefs than I do. So my point, though, is that there are elements of what is remarkable, the extent to which hatred of Muslims, which is really what Islamophobia means, and hatred of Jews, which is really what anti-Semitism means, are so overlapping and echoing in Western, European, and New World cultures, which is to say that they both have their origins in separate religious accusations against the communities, like deicide and blood libel when it comes to Jews, and the fear and hatred of Muslims as usurpers and conquerors and peoples who are to be greatly feared because they acquired a lot of power, and then mocked because they lost it rather quickly. I mean, not quickly, but rather dramatically. In the collapse of Muslim power was relatively quick in European terms. It happened over a couple of hundred years. The characteristics are very similar. The caricatures of Arabs and Muslims in American cinema and pop culture in the 60s and 70s and 80s are indistinguishable from caricatures of Jewish features. It's always the hook nose and a little beard and a little thing, and it's the Semitic features, the exaggerated Semitic features, which are rendered as rat-like. And then there are these tropes. I can't go through them all, but they're consistent, especially the idea of these slimy rat-like men with Semitic features preying on innocent young blonde women, Christian white women. And this is very reminiscent. I look at Der Stürmer and I see stuff that looks like anti-Arab propaganda and pop culture from the 70s, especially in the immediate aftermath of the oil embargo of 1973, which was one of the many inflection points that if I had an hour, I would tell you all about. But more importantly, there's a great symmetry between the 19th century and early 20th century stereotypes of Jews as both, what you were saying exactly, as both the power center and the disruptors simultaneously. So you had these stereotypes of the Jewish banker, the Jewish oligarch, the Rothschilds and what have you, on the one hand, and the bomb-throwing Jewish anarchist revolutionary who's responsible for every political crisis that ever happened. And there is this idea that they work in cahoots secretly, that the Baron de Rothschild is funding Trotsky, and they're in cahoots. Well, let me tell you that the banker, the Jewish banker, becomes the Arab oil sheikh very easily, and the bomb-throwing Jewish revolutionary is the Arab or Islamic terrorist, and again they're in cahoots because again and again and again we keep hearing about how Al-Qaeda was secretly run by the Saudi government, which is obviously not true, and how these countries that were being targeted by these terrorists were actually responsible for them in a very direct way, not in an indirect way. You could make a very solid case about Saudi Arabia promoting extremism and intolerance and all that was true. But the idea that they were specifically behind this plot to overthrow themselves. And at one time I was on TV with this guy, and he was insisting that this was the case. And I said, you're saying they're so crazy that they are the authors of a conspiracy, the main goal of which is to overthrow and kill themselves. And he said, yes. I said, well, I can't beat that. You know? But my point is, once again, when you come to Islamophobia, there is an element of punching up. And it's not with these communities, certainly not in Europe, where you really, the Arab and North African and Turkish populations, Muslim populations, often fill the role that here are filled by Mesoamerican migrant laborers, right? They're sort of the migrant workers. But the American Muslims tend to be much better educated. They're more per capita better educated, better, more prosperous, etc. And when it comes to the oil kingdoms and the oil sheikhs, that's often a sense of punching up. You know, hating them is hating people who have power, financial power, and they are disliked for that power. And it's been that way since '73.
Yeah, I think it is very important to trace out how these overlaps occur. And one area where I'm gonna be nitpicky because I don't think we actually disagree. But you said like that it's about hatred of Jews, it's about hatred of Muslims.
That's what
right?
I said.
And I don't know if it's just about hatred. Right,
well,
and I think that you know, hatred. There's plenty of
hatred.
people who hate me, right? I've learned that just by reading my emails, right?
Yeah.
But you know, there's people who don't hate Jews, but maybe fear Jews,
Right.
or mistrust Jews, or are averse to Jews. There's a lot of ways that this can go down,
True.
right? And the phenomenological focus on being hated, or you know, people who are burning crosses, right, and you know, who are wearing white robes. You know, it's not that that's not important, right? I think that's very important, right? But it is a part of a larger picture, right? And so when we think about, you know, the ways that anti-Semitism manifests and Islamophobia manifests for that matter, right? I think we have to hold two thoughts together at the same time, right? Which is, on the one hand, right, there is, I think, a very important difference between the conscious bigot and the microaggressor, right? And I think that we can admit to degrees of offense, right? And so there are different ways of, you know, anti-Semitism isn't just about people who are, you know, hoping to become the next Hitler, right? And we shouldn't think of it that way, right? And so while on the one hand, right, we need to, you know, think of anti-Semitism more broadly, right? There are different points, and Islamophobia more broadly, there are different points of intervention between the person who is, you know, kind of publicly spinning out these, you know, kind of wild-eyed conspiracy theories where, you know, they're just open, everything traces back to the Jews, or everything traces back to the Arab oil sheiks, right? Compared to, you know, the person who knows that's ridiculous, who is very, very convinced that's ridiculous, right? But, you know, who, you know, when they hear, you know, their Jewish roommate or dorm mate, you know, expressing concern or sadness or frustration, they're always wondering, you know, is this real, or are you playing the deeper game, right? Is this a move? Is this a manipulation, right? For, you know, I don't want to speak. I think this probably does happen with Islamophobia too, but I'm more confident in my assertions about anti-Semitism. I think a very common thing we see with respect to anti-Semitism is, you know, you've always got to be on your guard because they're always playing a deeper game, right? And that it's that what is presented as organic concern about the status of Jews, ways that they are, you know, might be being obstructed on campus or being made to feel lesser, right, isn't really true, right? Isn't really real, right? Yeah. It's just a way of kind of playing a political gambit. It's playing the anti-Semitism card. And here is an area where I've learned a ton talking about these interdisciplinary connections from the way, you know, from the literature about the claim about playing the race card, right? And the way that gets used to sort of avoid or diminish conversations that we really should be having and need to be having about issues of racism and racial inequality. That it's not that we're not allowed to disagree. It's not that we're not allowed to have different opinions, right? But the notion that it's not even sincere, that it's not even genuine, right? That it's not even genuinely felt, is something that I think is very, very hurtful, right? And I think is a way that we cocoon ourselves to avoid thinking some harder thoughts, right? But I do think those thoughts are easier when we remember what I said a minute ago, which is that we're not just saying, you know, oh, you're a secret Hitler, right? That's what's happening here. No, there's a lot more to this than that. And we can think critically and we can think honestly about issues of anti-Semitic exclusion, about Islamophobic exclusion, that manifest not from people whose fondest wish is to become a monster, right? But for people who, in many ways, are acting in good faith, right? And are and you know, they are imbibing certain cultural prejudices, or they just don't know certain things, right? Jews are a very small minority, right? I don't begrudge anybody who doesn't know that much about us, right? There's not that many of us, right? I'm a little grudging when people think they know a lot about us and they and they kind of don't want to learn more, right? They assume they already know everything they need to know, right? But if we start from this premise of, you know, we assume that these sediments are real, that there's more for us to learn, that it's not something that can be discerned at a glance, right? Which is something I think very much Orientalism says about Arabs and Muslims, that it's a simple culture, we can know it all at a glance, right? And with Jews, I think you get it through a slightly different mechanism of, oh, Judeo-Christian, I know Christians, therefore it's like buy one, get one free, right?
Very good,
You start to push past that and have that sort of cultural and intellectual humility and openness. And I think there's a lot of, we can walk pretty far with one another. And we can do so, importantly, even where we disagree. And that, I think, is really, really crucial.
Well, if our last timing weren't draconian enough, we're going to ask you to respond in 4 minutes to the next one. What is the one thing you really feel like people in the U.S. are most misunderstanding about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia right now?
So you want a 4-minute answer to that?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. That's easy. Okay, I think that the most elided thing, and the most important and the most elided both, so it's both the most elided and the most importantly elided, reality about Islam, about Muslims, about people who have their origins in Muslim communities, people who, like Edward Said said he was not a Muslim because he was a Christian, but he came from a Muslim culture, which I think was true. It was an interesting way of putting it. You know, all of that. That I think there is this notion that is promoted both by repressive forces within these communities, people who seek religious and cultural authority within Muslim and other similar communities, adjacent communities, internally in fairly small or even big, ranges, and Islamophobes who band together to create these narratives about Muslims or Arabs or what have you, and often they don't know the difference between the two and they can't figure it out, and it's very simple, but they don't bother to find out. That there is a relatively strong degree of homogeneity among Muslims, in Muslim communities, in the Muslim experience, etc. That is the opposite of the truth, right? Right now in the world, about 1 in 5 people is a Muslim or comes from a Muslim community. That means that the word Muslim and the word human are pretty much the same thing. I mean, it's very hard to separate the two. It'd be very hard to find a manifestation of the human experience that was not heavily represented in mainstream elements of some Muslim culture somewhere, now and historically. just about anything. All the things that people stereotypically think Muslims aren't supposed to do, as a matter of fact, they do on a systematic basis in some parts of the world, and historically over time that's also been true. You could, I suppose, make an exception for the idea of atheism or agnosticism and say that, well, if you're not a monotheist and you don't believe in revelation like me, then you just can't be a Muslim, and that's probably true. But that is such a baseline that it really becomes kind of meaningless. And the idea that Muslims do this and they don't do that, and they think this and they don't think that, and when in fact, in the grand kaleidoscope of Islamic and Muslim experiences, which are different things, by the way, they refer to that. Those are adjectives that function differently. And they're often used interchangeably in a crude way, which again reflects the ignorance of speakers. There is this, as I say, in the Muslim experiences, historically and today around the world, there is this kaleidoscopic representation of virtually the entire range of human experiences. And I'm not talking about that guy over there in the dark in his closet. I mean, obviously. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about often as a cultural norm, or at least part of a culture. And that's extremely important, because what it tells you is that it's not possible to pigeonhole Muslims, or for that matter, therefore necessarily Islam. And I've had the arguments with people who call themselves American Muslim leaders, who will say, and did say to me at a meeting in Qatar, there is only one Islam. And that's manifestly not true. There are countless forms of Islam. There are countless Islams in as I said, a kaleidoscopic world of Islam that contains multitudes.
So I'm going to kind of go back to where I was a moment ago, and I raised it then because I think it's just a really important thing and what I do think is one of the most misunderstood things about anti-Semitism in contemporary American culture, which is it's not a gotcha, right? It is not primarily something like some slur people throw out when they just feel like they're losing an argument and want to hurt somebody, right? The vast majority of the time, when Jews, and I'm specifying Jews because I'm intentionally not including non-Jews in, say, Congress, right, in this category, right? But when Jews say they're experiencing anti-Semitism, right, it is primarily because they are experiencing something real and hurtful and harmful, right? That does not mean that every time a Jewish person says something is anti-Semitic, they're always 100% right. Any more than any member of any group that asserts something is biased towards them, deserves some sort of immediate deference. That's not how it works. That's not how it should work, right? But we can assume, and I think we should assume, that the sentiments are genuine and they're acting in good faith, right? It's not just a smear for the sake of it. And in particular, right? And so you know, I'll touch the third rail. Most Jews are absolutely capable of understanding that not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, right? That is not a controversial statement, right? That is not a position held by anybody. There are a wide range of criticisms one can make, many of which will be shared by many Jews, including ones who care very deeply about Israel and its flourishing and sustenance, and that will stand very little chance of being accused of anti-Semitism. And because of that, right, one should assume that if a particular criticism is being alleged to be anti-Semitic by a Jewish friend or classmate or colleague, right, it is probably not because they are conflating criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, right? It probably stems from something more substantive than that, right? Now, again, that doesn't mean that they are necessarily right. You have to immediately agree with them, right? But when we try to dig into what is going on under the hood there, right, that very simplistic and I think kind of patronizing notion that, oh, you only think this because you don't understand that there's a difference between Jews. That's not between Jews and Israel. That's not the mistake they're making, right? If they are making a mistake, it's not that, right? It is something more substantive, right? I mentioned, before that, one issue we have is we just have a lot of different definitions for all sorts of isms that range from only conscious bigotry to dealing more with matters of structure and impact, right? And so it's possible that disagreement derives primarily just from operating under different paradigms, right? They're thinking in terms more about impact, and somebody else is thinking more in terms of, is there sort of intentional malice here, right? And that, again, the debate over which framework is best is an important one to have. We can disagree about it, but that disagreement is of a more substantive quality, right, than somebody who just doesn't understand that Jew and Israel are different words, right? And so I think that recognizing that we should hope, right? And again, this is something that we should treat any group, any marginalized group, any group, frankly, period, right? That when we're talking about elements deeply enmeshed in their own experience, right, they have at least some idea what they're talking about, right? It's not, again, it's not that they can't be wrong, but they're probably not wrong in quite that obvious of a fashion, right? And when we start from that premise, then we can start unpacking a little more about what's actually going on under the hood, right? And again, my experience is that when people take that approach and say, I'm going to assume that there is something here that's worth digging out, right? We start not closing the space for important critical conversation about Israel, about Palestine, about anything else, but we open it, right? Because when people recognize that, feel as if their legitimate concerns are being taken seriously, right? You'd be surprised how far people will walk with you down pretty precarious terrain. And that's been my experience overwhelmingly.
Totally.
That the people who are willing to take my concerns seriously, right, I in turn are much more willing to assume that what they are trying to express, right, has a there too. And we come together in that form of shared horizon, and that's how we grow. But it's stunted immediately, right? And I think, in a really dangerous way, when we indulge in the notion that, oh, this can be resolved easily, it's just a smear, right? That, I think, is the move that we really have to work hard to take out of our vocabulary. I understand how tempting it is, but it's really too cheap of a move for an issue that's too serious.
And
Okay, so
do we each get a minute?
Yes,
That's
we're
it?
doing great with time, so we'll give you each a minute. That's great.
Okay. I mean, I want to say it's really tricky. The question of Israel and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism are all bundled up together. Because, I've been both a supporter of a two-state solution my entire career, and therefore someone who meets on a very friendly basis with those Israelis who are willing to talk with mutual respect, and kind of a promoter of people living side by side together, and that everybody has their self-determination, which is valid, and all people are equal, and all that kind of thing. But I have been frequently attacked as, Cal Thomas, this guy called me on O'Reilly's show when he had it, America's leading anti-Semite. And I've been called things like that my entire career. At the same time, I've been frequently called a Zionist and somebody who has sold out. I want my check. I haven't received a check yet, but somebody who's sold out to the Jews and the Zionists and what have you. And that's so. I'm very familiar with this terrain, but I want to say it becomes very tricky. There is a gray zone where you have to really maintain your balance of telling the difference between strident, hyperbolic rhetoric that is very critical in a way that's totally over the top, but that is not anti-Semitic. And it would work in reverse, right? Criticism of Palestinians or Arabs or anybody that then would not. And I'm going to give you an example. there is no, CUNY Law School is having their graduation, and there is no student speaker this year for the first time. And it's because last year there was this Yemeni American student, this lady, I don't remember her name, who was elected by the other students to give the student speech. And she gave this speech that was like straight out of 1968. And it was very Bolshevik and full of this Marxist-Leninist rhetoric and revolutionary. And she was attacked as anti-Semitic. And though there was only one sentence, it's a long sentence, but one sentence dealing with Israel. But that's, you know, I mean, she called the New York Police Department fascists, which I think is the closest to defamation she actually came. But this is what she said about Israel. I want to sort of consider it. Quote, Israel continues to indiscriminately rain bullets and bombs on worshippers, murdering the old, the young, attacking even funerals and graveyards, as it encourages lynch mobs to target Palestinian homes and businesses, as it imprisons its children, as it continues its project of settler colonialism, expelling Palestinians from their homes, carrying out the ongoing Nakba, close quote. Now, here's what I have to say about that. It is extreme hyperbole. It is very one-sided, right? I mean, it completely ignores that there are other parties at work here. It is, yeah, I mean, hyperbolic is the right word for it. It cherry picks from reality and takes the worst aspects of what happens in the occupied, and has happened in the occupied territories in say, the 12 months. But here's the thing. Everything that she alleged in that sentence actually happened in the occupied territories in the 12 months before she spoke. Now, a lot of other things happened that she left out. So what I'm trying to say here is that in my evaluation, this is in no means anti-Semitic. What it is highly irresponsible, over the top, hyperbolic, hyperventilating, hysterical, I would say, political propaganda that's extremely anachronistic and would have been stupid in 1968 where it belongs, and how it ended up being uttered anywhere in last year, I don't know. But I don't think any of that constitutes anti-Semitism, because all of it is criticism of elements of Israel's behavior. It's one-sided, it's hyperbolic, it's to some extent exaggerated. None of it's factually untrue. And I don't think any of it is directed at Jews qua Jews. It's an attack on Israel and Israel's behavior in the occupied territories.
Yeah. So I think, the question, is that anti-Semitic, goes down to, what's our definition, right?
Yes.
But one thing that I think, is in some ways more important, right?
Yeah.
And I think you would agree with me here, right? When you say it's like it's hyperbolic, right? It's not giving a full picture. It's meant to paint in a very inflammatory posture, even though it's drawing on reality. And we can imagine a different sort of speaker giving a different sort of speech that is both equally true, right? Running from the other side, but equally inflammatory.
I did imagine.
Oh yeah, it's not. I mean, it's not hard, and we can. Yes. But so if we imagine though, right? Let's say a Jewish listener comes out of that speech and says that was anti-Semitic, right?
They did.
And we want to say, on the one hand, and you gave a very kind of, I'll use this as a compliment because I'm a lawyer, lawyerly parsing of the speech, right? We say it's not, right? And I think it's very important to do that and to make that argument. But when they say that, right? What they are communicating, again, probably isn't reducible, right? And would be inaccurate to reduce it to, like, oh, you just don't understand that she was talking about Israel, right? We can understand that, why at least some sorts of Jewish persons would feel very uncomfortable, would be, that this was my graduation, right? And feeling that way. And so when we approach it that way, right? Not as like, oh, by making this claim of anti-Semitism, right? You're, just engaged in this bad faith gambit, but rather you're reflecting a real experience that we're having that we should think about how to manage, right? I think we end up being a lot more productive. I think we get a lot further, right? And whether or not that gets grouped into anti-Semitism or not, right? again, as I said, I partake some of the broader views here, right? But when I think about the sorts of environments that would make a Jewish student or Israeli student or a Muslim student or a Palestinian student feel like this place isn't for me, right? This place doesn't really want me here. This place doesn't look at me the same way, right? Right. That sort of rhetoric, right? That sort of immediate push towards being the most inflammatory, very much can have that environment, right? Create that environment. And so if we don't want that environment, right, we should be thinking about like, well, what are my responsibilities? You know, even though I have a First Amendment right to say these things, which you do, right? You know, what are my obligations as a good kind of moral citizen, right?
I think we can agree that it was a very irresponsible speech, no doubt about it. Inappropriate and irresponsible. And, it is those things.
For me, maybe this is a good way of putting it, right? Rather than saying like, how do we avoid being anti-Semitic? How do we avoid being Islamophobic, right? How do we become responsible co-community members to the various groups that we value as part of our community, and we think of it that way.
Can I make it?
There are ways we wouldn't necessarily.
I'd like to pick up on that, if I may, very briefly. Very briefly. Okay, I'll give you an example of how we can do that. So I think it's very clear. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that when a lot of Jewish students, pro-Israel Jewish students, hear the chant "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," they hear something exclusionary and something that sort of wishes Jews away in Palestine. When, however, the people who chant it, I think it's pretty clear most of them, or at least very large numbers of them, are imagining a golden era of shared citizenship and non-discrimination and that kind of thing. Nobody ever stops to ask the chanting students, what did you mean by that? It is simply asserted, okay, this is anti-Semitic, right? When it could mean anything. It's a chant for freedom, right? I can understand why Jewish students might hear, I mean, obviously they would be uncomfortable with what I read, but "From the river to the sea, Palestine would be free" sounds like sorry? Not necessarily in solidarity. In solidarity, wait, that's wrong. That's wrong. Most of the protests are not in solidarity with Hamas. Most of the protests are in solidarity with the people of Palestine, with the people who are being killed. All right, those kids are leftists. They're not out there in solidarity. Some of them are.
Excuse me, we're taking questions only on cards.
So my point is that the way to do it.
Now is a good time to start writing your questions on cards, and Harinder will circulate soon to get them. We'll let Hussein finish, and then let David have a minute or two, and then take your questions.
Well, my point is simply that, building on what David was saying, the better approach would be to have a conversation in which people who chant that are asked, what did you mean? And then they get to explain what they mean. And then the people who heard it a different way get to explain why they hear it a different way, and maybe that explanation didn't work for them. And you could have had a more serious conversation if you'd gotten ahead of the game.
Yeah. Right. I think you'll be very tickled. I saw a poll recently, and it asked that question, what did you hear? What did you mean? Right. Yeah. And it was most Jewish students hear that, and they hear it as at least a call for expulsion. Right. If not worse. Right. Most of Muslim students who chanted that said they thought it meant a two-state solution, which I wouldn't. I would have been on a one-state solution, but not two. And so again, that question of what do we mean by free? And then it depends if you look at it from the river to the sea or freedom, and that where do you? And what I would say is, to the extent where we have a lot more overlap than we think, then we can start to say, on the one hand, if they don't actually disagree with you, do you have to be that averse to the chant? And then on the other hand, if they don't actually disagree with you, do you really need that chant, right? And maybe we figure out somewhere to meet in the middle. A good Palestinian friend of mine said, she's like, well, David, you identify as a Zionist, I identify with an anti-Zionist. Other than that, we agree with each other on basically everything, right? And it's like, so what, we could get really hung up on the terminology, right? Or we could just, kind of drill down to it and say, well, we want so much of the same things. Why are we looking for ways to, searching for antagonism,
Yeah.
right? Searching for a way that like I'm going to interpret this as trying to hurt me, or I'm going to stick with
Yeah.
this even though I know it hurts, right? We can just choose to do better than that, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I, by the way, I proposed an alternative chant. From the river to the sea, everybody must be free.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that? That's sorted. But no one listens to me.
Okay, we are going to move on to questions. So, okay, or not, we will. Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, just that we're going to just do in like 2 minutes, because we want to finish promptly at 6:30 and want to make sure to take some of your questions. Just in 2 minutes each, how can we each become aware of our own biases in the arena of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and combat them? Just very quick answers from each of you, Hussein and then David.
Yeah. I'll start. Because I have very strong views on this. Mistrust all your instincts. When you're having an emotional reaction, there's probably something wrong with it. When you get a piece of information or a piece of data that you think is information that appears to reinforce your biases, that appears to reinforce your assumptions, mistrust it. It's probably wrong. And the reason I say it's probably wrong is that we live in a world of echo chambers and silos where our ideas get reinforced and we get pushed into the extremes. And that leads us, I think, to look at other people in the worst possible light and to be as paranoid and suspicious about others as we can be. And that's what leads, I think, most to fear and hatred. The opposite of it is, of course, dialogue. And so what you do instead of indulging that is seek out people who disagree with you and ask them what they think and why, and talk to them and find out that, in fact, even when the disagreement appears colossal, it may actually not be as unbridgeable as you thought. It might be. Occasionally it is, right? But often it's not. Yeah. Often it's not. There are barriers. I'll give you one quick example. I've always found dealing with Zionist Jewish groups that a key to getting their attention from a pro-Palestinian perspective is to begin by acknowledging the Jewish attachment to the land, tradition, and investment and narrative and presence in the land, right? You just acknowledge it up front. Like, no one's denying this history. Okay, we're accepting it up front. That had a great softening effect because they really didn't expect it from us when we were at the American Task Force on Palestine. And we would always lead with that. And they would say, oh, maybe they have something to say.
I definitely want to give us this hearty second to that notion about kind of mistrusting what confirms prior biases. Because one of the trends that is most upsetting to me that I see, a lot of people do with respect to, for example, the campus process that we've been seeing, is people, it's very clear that they're just trawling for the worst, that they're looking for the speaker with the worst message or the sign with the most inflammatory posture, right? And it's not that these things don't exist. It's not that they're not important. They are, right? And we shouldn't be in denial that they exist. We have to recognize that they do, right? But there's that excitement about, look how right I am. You're giving yourself permission to not open up, right? To stay mistrustful. And what I would say, really the hardest but most important thing is to approach things with an open mind.
Right.
And the reason why that's so hard is I would hope for everybody here, if you already believed something was anti-Semitic, right, you wouldn't be doing it, right? You wouldn't be advocating it, right? And so that means that any claim of anti-Semitism that implicates something you're doing or something you believe in, right, you're going to start with the presumption that it's wrong, right?
That's right.
And the same would be true for Islamophobia, obviously. Right?
Absolutely.
And again, it's not that you have to immediately drop that belief and just agree with what you're being told, right? But if you immediately jump from that disagreement to sort of how very dare you, right?
Yes.
This is how dare you make me think about this, and view the very ask of being asked to contemplate the possibility of anti-Semitism, that's going to lead you to a bad place, right? And so anybody who is promising you a way to no longer have to think across difference and engage across difference and learn across difference and say, you already know this. Here, I'm going to feed you more that tells you the thing you already know is all you need to know, right? It's delicious dessert, right? It's so tasty, right? And I love, it's so easy to indulge in, but it's not going to lead you to the right place. And that sort of cloisteredness and closed-mindedness, right? That, is the handmaiden of ostracization and pylons and termination of collaboration and all of that thing. It's all predicated on people who think they already know the things they need to know and they can turn inward. And it just never goes anywhere good, right? So that, we talked about how we avoid falling into the trap, right? It's about cultivating and I don't want to undersell it, a very difficult thing, which is that posture of open receptivity, even when you're not starting from a position of immediate and automatic agreement.
Yeah, confirmation bias is the enemy.
Okay, let's go to questions so that we want to end on time at 6:30. So let's go to questions.
I think a wonderful question that will make you dive deeper into this, perhaps. In what ways do you recommend we educate ourselves on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that doesn't outline those issues as very black and white? And they say you can also recommend your own work.
You first.
I mean, it's a good question because there's a lot of bad out there, right? And this is going to be, this might be a weird thing for me to say, but I think one of the risk factors, one of the things you should be on alert for, is the approach that says, anti-Semitism, for example, is the ultimate evil. It's something, it's just something just unimaginably bad, which is a weird thing for me to say, right? But what I'm trying to get at is that notion that there are degrees. And when we're talking about anti-Semitism, we're not just talking about the secret Hitler wannabes, right? And so thinking, when you get approaches that think of it in more layered terms, right? I think that those are going to serve you a lot better than the ones that are prepping you, I'll use a term that's equally antagonistic to us both, prepping you for a crusade, right? Which will not do anything good for either Jews or Muslims, right? Never does. Yeah. Right? So, they say you can recommend your own work. I think the Nexus document really is trying to chart out this middle path. And for that reason, I say it's the best anti-Semitism definition that nobody is using, because it turns out that nobody wants the middle path, right? But I think we're good, right? I think it's a good one to go for, right? But that notion that even, it's so easy to think that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, it's a problem of demons and monsters and the inhuman, right? And it's a lot scarier in some ways to recognize that these problems exist amongst people who are fully human, right? They're friends, they're neighbors, they're people have good ideas and good thoughts, right? And great attributes about them. And the fact that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia exists in those spaces too, doesn't mean you're wrong not to think that they're monsters. It's that you're right to think that these exist even in good spaces and places that are worthy of our support, are worthy of, our care and concern, right? And so, instead of trying to say, let's find the bad people and extirpate them and toss them out and ostracize them and cancel them, boycott them and get, because then we'll be just left with the people who are good, it's never going to work, right? Because in a society that is so permeated with, and it's been built on narratives that run so deep, you talked about this so well, of how we view Muslims, how we view Jews in very negative ways, you're never going to find that quarantine clean space, right? And you shouldn't try, right? And so by recognizing, this is a alarming thing to say, but I think a true one, that anti-Semitism is everywhere, right? We also recognize that, we can't go nowhere, so we have to work within the community that we have. And I think that's going to bring you to a more productive space than the people who are trying to paint a monster for you and saying, go fight.
Okay, I agree with all of that. It says just about everything that needs saying. I'll only add that I've never read anything really, really good about Islamophobia. I think it's yet to be written.
Didn't you say you wrote 3 books?
Yeah, but those are reference books. I've written mini essays, but I don't think they're really, really good. I think they're okay. I think a lot of, you know, there's a lot of okay. But okay, you know, is different than, look, you know, everything you said is what needs to be done and said. So I don't have anything to add. I think it's exactly right. Well, maybe we can go to another question.
I'll just add that the Nexus document that David mentioned is linked in his bio at the website for this event.
I mean, I would say this, which is that you got to understand that if you look at the world through the lens of identities and cultures and separateness, you are missing the fundamental reality of common humanity. And I don't mean that in a kumbaya way. I mean that, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a history of people doing people stuff to other people. And you could have moved them around in different positions and they would have behaved in very, very similar ways. Because human beings in collective groups, not individuals are different, small groups are different, but in big chunks, people really tend to behave in similar ways. The patterns repeat themselves all the time. And what's most corrosive about forms of bias, prejudice, negative prejudice, and also positive prejudice, fetishism. You know, people who take undue pride in their own society, who are chauvinistic about their own people and their own culture, both are making the same mistake, which is to think that there's a big difference between that set of people and the other set of people. I've never seen it. It doesn't exist. Human beings are so hardwired into patterns of behavior, and I really think it is their circumstances that drive their reactions much more than anything else.
So how do we move to support a values-forward process instead of a results-backward plan for action? Does that remove the inherent likelihood of conflict based on asserting the objectivity of one of two subjective narratives? In other words, would that help? Even more than fragile intersectionality?
Read me the first part again.
How do we move to support a values-forward process?
Values forward, okay.
Instead of
I understand
a
now.
results-backward plan for action.
Yeah, okay, I understand exactly what you mean. Do you want to take a shot at it, or should I?
You said you understood exactly what they mean, so
Oh, yeah, I think so. Yeah. Values forward rather than results oriented. So, in other words, it's the old dilemma between the principles, sort of the idealism, Kant versus the pragmatist versus what's his name?
Dewey?
Not with Dewey, but
Mill.
even before Mill, utilitarianism. It's Kant versus Mill is basically the question, I would say. And here's the thing. I mean, I think you would make a big mistake, actually, if you said, okay, I want to move towards a values-based approach rather than a results-based approach, because then you would end up with a set of values driving you ultimately into, when taken to a logical conclusion, a very stupid outcome. And if you had simply a pragmatic approach that was devoid of values, you would end up with what the questioner is implicitly criticizing, which is correct, which is a kind of vacuous pragmatism that's results-oriented in a kind of very narrow institutional way that really is sort of ultimately useless. And what you actually need is both. You need a bit of both. And if I have understood the questioner, I think I wouldn't dispense with a pragmatic approach in favor of a values-based approach. I would import values into my pragmatism. In fact, one of my books was called Principles in Pragmatism.
Yeah. Yep, I'll sign on to that, and because if we can just keep name dropping political theorists, which I love to do, because that's what I got my doctorate in, and I like to think it was semi worth my time. Like the Rawlsian reflective equilibrium, right? It's and we all do. It's for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a very intuitive thing, and it's something that we all do, which we all have principles we try to abide by,
Right.
and we all have end results we're trying to achieve, right? And we can't just abandon our principles every time it doesn't lead to a result we don't like, because then what's the point of having a principle? Right. But also, it'd be nonsense to say I'm going to stick to my principles come hell or high water, no matter what the consequences are, right? Like the reason we have principles is hopefully they're going to develop good states of the world going forward, right? And so when we start to see those tensions, right? Well, sometimes what do? Well, we adjust the principles to make sure that they can result in tolerable outcomes. And sometimes we, accept, outcomes that we'd like less because it's important to abide by the principle. And by kind of constantly pinching in and adjusting one towards the other, we end up getting to an equilibrium that simultaneously is leading to a good state of the world, but also is reflective of moral principles that we feel good about endorsing as general rules.
Or you end up corrupting both because you mess up every time.
Well, yes, but it's true. But I think the idea, and I gather what the questioner is worried about, I think it's a legitimate worry, is people starting with this sort of bottom line of, well, what I want is presumably some sort of maximalist solution where my side just gets everything it wants, and then I work backwards to fit a bunch of fake value systems that let me justify being a maximalist, right? And I don't think that can work, and I don't think that should work, right? There's no substitute for fundamentally believing, right, that if we're talking, this is true of Israelis and Palestinians with anything else, that they both matter, right?
Yeah,
and that
exactly.
they have legitimate claims that we need to respect. And if you're ultimately looking for a reason why either of those two parties kind of doesn't count, right? And it's forfeited it, or either actions or whatever else, no longer has a claim, right? There's nothing that I can do that's going to get you to a just place, because you're just looking for a way to be told it's okay to just kind of stomp all over the other, right?
Yeah, you've removed their humanity, and by the way, there's this hue and cry now about the potential ICC arrest warrants being introduced for both Hamas leaders and Israeli leaders at the same time, and people are railing about an equivalency. There is an important equivalency here. They're all human beings, and those human beings have an equal responsibility not to break the laws of war. Now, you can talk about everything else, but that's a bottom line equivalency that seems to get missing a lot of times.
Let's take the next question.
Okay, I'll read two question cards together, okay? So the first card says, how should the phrase Jews for Palestine be interpreted? As a Jew, it feels hypocritical due to the anti-Zionist movement of the pro-Palestine movement.
I didn't get it.
Okay, so I'll read it again?
Yeah.
Okay. How should we phrase Jews for Palestine? How should the phrase Jews for Palestine be interpreted? As a Jew, it feels hypocritical due to the anti-Zionist movement of the pro-Palestine movement.
You want to read the other question?
And I'll read the other question too. Maybe they can be answered together. Okay,
Yeah.
so this one addresses David directly. David, you spoke about how some people are searching for antagonism.
Antagonism, yeah.
Okay. At the same time, assume Jewish people are telling the truth about their experience. How do you reconcile these two responses?
Well, I didn't understand that either.
Yeah.
You did good.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
Well, that's
So with respect to the Jews for Palestine one, and I think it goes back to what you were saying about Jews like Muslims are a they, not a nit, right? And there's diversity of opinion, right? And the least Jewish thing I can possibly imagine is assuming that we're going to agree with one another, right?
Right.
So again, I think for any political position a Jew or anybody else would take, I try to play the ball, not the man, right? And it's not, there's no contradiction in being Jewish and having whatever opinion you have. And I would and in particular, regardless of whether I would feel alienated, right, in a particular space, right, I never say you're wrong not to feel alienated, right? If you feel comfortable in a given space, I'm genuinely happy for you, right?
Of course.
It doesn't mean that I'm wrong not to, right? And so, if the positions are wrong, the positions are wrong. But there's nothing about being Jewish that prevents one from taking a position that I think is wrong, right? Whether or not Jews for Palestine is the wrong position at all, which would depend on what a given organization is or isn't saying, right? So I don't see the contradiction. I think that it represents something very, very Jewish, which is a plurality of positions and beliefs amongst Jewish people, right? And that's incredibly normal. With respect to on the one hand, assuming that Jews are saying something real, which I think we are, versus not trolling for the worst moments and using them to, so there's sort of an inward and an outward perspective here, right? And the way that I'm talking, and in these cases, I always have to be cognizant about this, because sometimes I view myself as talking primarily to a non-Jewish audience, and I'm saying, like, how should you respond to Jews, right? And when Jews say they're experiencing this anti-Semitism, how should you relate to that? And you shouldn't be viewing it as, sort of this trick or ploy, and I stand by that. And sometimes I view myself and I speak in a register where I'm talking to Jews, right, as part of Jews. And then, I might be speaking differently, that we, shouldn't always be looking to kind of confirm and reconfirm of one of the greatest underrated Jewish thinkers out there, Albert Memmi, says, of insistence, right, where we just wrap ourselves in this sort of cocoon where that is built around the notion of knowing how much everybody else hates us, and that can be really, really self-destructive, right? So and to some extent this is my bad, because I was kind of flitting between those two registers without being clear about it. And so if you're not Jewish and you just repeated back to me that whole thing, it seems like Jews are really just looking for the worst in the protests, and it's kind of a BS move. Then I'd be like, no, don't say that, right? Like I get to say that, right? And those sort of internal versus external group dynamics, I think, are valid. I don't think that's a bad move. Right. But I think that there's value simultaneously, and on the one hand, recognizing that these things are present in protest campaigns, in the pro-Palestinian movement. We shouldn't be delusional about them. We shouldn't deny that they exist. They absolutely do, right? And they're not being made up. Yeah. And at the same time, right, if we're trying to extend that same notion of interpretive charity and grace, we should also assume that students, Muslim students, non-Muslim students, whoever were part of this, there's also more going on than just, this is just an opportunity to yell at Jews, and I'm really excited about it, right? Then always assume there's more under the surface.
That's exactly
Everybody's more complex than you give them credit for.
No, that's exactly right. Always assume there's more going on under the hood. And I mean, for example, this has been a two-way street, in the sense that there's been a lot of censorship of pro-Palestinian students. I'm not talking about protesters. I'm talking about speakers who've been canceled. I'm talking about valedictorians who weren't allowed to speak not because of anything else, but because of credible threats of violence coming from people that didn't want to hear it. And by far the biggest explosion of violence in this whole protest movement thing was the attack by pro-Israel students on the encampment at UCLA.
Not students.
Sorry?
Not students.
It wasn't students, okay. But the attack by hooligans.
Yes.
Weapon-wielding hooligans, and the police standing by, and that was really amazing. Anyway, my point is, I agree very strongly with that. The one thing I do want to say is I'm uncomfortable with the idea of fetishizing people's comfort. If people, I don't like this thing about, well, I felt uncomfortable. Well, good, you felt uncomfortable, because you should feel uncomfortable. In a university, you should feel uncomfortable. Maybe in a workplace, you should not feel uncomfortable. That's fine. But I think if in a university, in a place of knowledge, right, it's important to be made to feel uncomfortable. You won't learn anything if you sit there and say, I demand to feel comfortable all the time. What? Good.
Excuse me, we're
Who the
taking
hell
the
do you think
questions
you're
only on
talking
the
to?
cards.
You don't know a thing about me. You didn't make me feel uncomfortable. You interrupted me and you're acting like a jerk. Renounce these things. Do you understand? Do you have any understanding? Look, man,
Excuse me?
you don't know who I am. Okay, I have been one of the biggest critics of Hamas in this country from day one. I said, actually, after October 7, I wrote a piece that said very clearly, Palestinians should never forgive Hamas for this, ever. And that Hamas should be done for, in my opinion. Now, that's my view. It's not everybody else's view. But what? I'm not doing it for you.
Excuse me, can someone help?
Just look, I'm not here to have a colloquy with you. I'm not interested in you. You haven't bothered to find out who I am. By being a jerk, not by challenging my ideas in a meaningful way. If you were saying something meaningful that made me feel uncomfortable because it challenged my assumptions, that would be one thing. But if you start yelling bullshit at me, that's just annoying. That's not making me feel uncomfortable. That's being a hemorrhoid in the national butt. So there's a difference.
Yeah, you know, to try to make something vaguely intellectual that's something that very much wasn't, right? When we were talking about, you know, one thing that I really struggle with is, you know, I'm a researcher on anti-Semitism. I'm collecting elements of anti-Semitism all the time, right? That's what I do. And yet, it's real, you know, you can take from that, you start to develop, you know, in some ways a malformed perception.
Totally.
Right? The assumption that Hussein has any belief about the hostages other than free them, right? It's not just, you know, that's false, although it is, right? It's why would you think otherwise? What you know, what was the discomfort that we saw there wasn't Hussein being uncomfortable. The discomfort we saw there was somebody who's speaking, you know, it was kind of what I said. It's somebody who really, really wanted somebody in your shoes to be the sort of person who couldn't condemn Hamas, who couldn't condemn, because then, you know, he can dismiss you, right?
Of course.
If you're more complicated than that, right?
That's right.
Then there's things that we need to dig under the hood for, right? So there was discomfort here, and I think what could have been productive discomfort that wasn't dealt with in a significant way.
No, I think that's a very good. That's really exactly right.
And we see that, you know, you know, these assumptions I think need to be really, really unpacked, right? In a way that we don't always, you know, we assume we already know. And so we don't peer further under the hood. I mean, one other thing I want to just say, you know, because you're absolutely right, and I've been tracking this, and they mentioned that I do a lot of work on campus free speech issues, and there's been a whole range of cases where Palestinian students and speakers have been, you know, blocked, censored, whatever. You know, we shouldn't think that this doesn't happen, you know, to Jewish or Israeli students too. Oh, and I'm curious, you know, at City University of New York, you talked about them. Hillel just had 2 of its events canceled by CUNY because CUNY said threats of violence, right?
Same thing.
There's so much more happening.
There's been a lot of that.
That's in common, right? But we start from this assumption that, you know, it's sort of only I'm the one who feels that way. You know, there's so much there. I don't think it's any accident. This happened to me. I'm not the only person who this has happened to.
Right.
Where the first person to reach out to me after October 7th was one of my Muslim colleagues, right? And that I'm not the only person who's given that account. And I think one of the reasons why, right? And this is, you know, the very grim thing that has the tiniest of silver lining to it, is that one thing that Jews and Muslims have experienced in common over the past 6 months, however long it's been, is they have learned that if the most horrible things happen to them or their family or their loved ones, there is some non-trivial portion of their community that will not care or worse will cheer it.
Right.
And that awful commonality, right, is itself a way of building a bridge that we might not otherwise expect to find.
Totally agree with that.
I think we should end.
Yeah.
We
Go
should
ahead.
end with that. I think that was a
Yeah.
good way to end.
With that
Sure.
awful
And,
commonality, all right.
Yeah, the awful commonality.
Yeah.
I
It's
learned
so true.
much tonight, and I think we all did. And we just want to say thank you both.
Thank
so,
you both.
Oh, no,
so,
thank
so
you very
much.
much.
Well done. Thank you.